Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 48 following episode 3, which was a interesting episode, to say the least, and led to a pretty interesting outcome by the end of it, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 16 people to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 16, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Justin. And Justin's someone who I was never high on in my rankings throughout the season, where it felt like he was very quiet. And I feel like this kind of justifies it, where we see him going out in this very unusual and somewhat explosive tribal. And I guess this was a way to make us not feel that bad for him. Though if I'm being honest, I feel like there were definitely some warning signs throughout the episode that he was probably going home, with obviously his talk during the journey and him going on that, losing his vote as a result of that, him talking about how he lied about risking his vote when he actually lost it, and really just banking on Cedric to stay by his side. So I feel like there's definitely foreshadowing there. However, it ultimately doesn't pay out, where we get to that tribal and there's just a lot of wonky new era stuff that happens that eventually results in him being taken out here. And I think in a lot of ways you can say that Justin got screwed over, in the sense that there were so many things that happened that were outside of his control that resulted in him being voted out. Where, for one, you have Mary using her shot in the dark and that actually hitting, which is obviously a function of luck there. But even then, that would not have mattered had he not lost his vote, which in itself is also something outside of his control, where for one, he had been picked for the journey by the other tribe. It's not as if he even volunteered to go on the journey. You have him on the journey being forced to risk his vote and being forced to do this challenge, because apparently giving the players a choice to just go back to camp isn't dangerous fun. And then the challenge itself is complete luck, where you're just rolling dice. It's not even as if you're solving a puzzle. So I feel like Justin was pretty much shoehorned into the situation of having to go on to a journey, having to risk his vote, having to essentially let his vote come down to rolling dice, and then losing his vote there, to where had that not happened, it would have been very easy for Cedric and Justin to just vote out Say on the revote there. But instead, through all this weird and wonky circumstances, he's in this situation to where he is in as much danger as he is. Now, I still think there are things that were within his control that he didn't play the best, like him not telling people that he had lost his vote to begin with. But I think the more important thing is at the tribal itself, where he doesn't really fight to stay. We're at the point where Cedric, his closest ally in the game, is the sole decider in who goes home. I feel like Say puts up way more of a fight to stay, while Justin just kind of plays passively there. So I do have to fault him for that aspect of it. But it's also a situation that he simply should not have been in to begin with, and it's really just a function of all this new era nonsense, and for lack of a better term. So at the end of the day, I feel like Justin is someone who definitely got a raw deal in the season, and I think that was reflected both gameplay wise and in his edit. But obviously he is now out of the game, to where he's here at number 16. And with that, we have 15 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how lucky I think they are to win the game, based on their edit and current game position. But in number 15, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Cedric. And I think this was a function of several things here, where I think edit-wise, this was not a great look for him, where once again, Cedric is going to tribal, and this time he is clearly the most important person behind this vote, where by the end, he is the only person that decides who goes home. But despite this, I feel like a lot of his content was very lackluster, where we barely get any focus on him in making this deliberation. Yes, we get a little bit of him weighing over whether to split the vote or not, whether that's a good idea, but we get almost none of his perspective over whether he truly stands on the tribe, and how voting between Say and Justin is this difficult decision. I feel like the fact that Cedric gets as minimal content as he does really shows that he is not a priority on the show. But I think his placement here is also the result of gameplay, where his actual decision to vote out Justin here is really bad. I feel like this was the wrong decision here. Him voting out his closest ally in Justin after having already voted for Say twice at this tribal, and also voting for Mary in the initial vote. He literally voted for every single person on the tribe over the course of this one tribal. And the fact that he kind of goes back on keeping Justin after fighting so hard to save him is really head scratching there. Now, he does say in the tribal that he wants Mary and Say to get along, which I guess, but even then, that's not even a good decision for him, where I feel like the main argument you can make for keeping Say around is that with Say and Mary having this conflict and want to go after each other, that keeping them around would just make Cedric the swing vote for the following round. But instead, he's kind of working against that by saying that they should work together. And the fact that Cedric is the one who voted against both of them, just gives them more of a reason to turn against him if they were to go back to tribal. But even then, I feel like keeping Justin around would have just made Cedric a swing vote anyway coming the next round if they were to go back to tribal. So at the end of the day, I feel like Cedric made the complete wrong decision. And even in this episode, you have people talking about how he's not the greatest strategist in the world, and I feel like this decision really confirms that in a lot of ways. So again, I feel like Cedric is someone who I don't really have much faith in edit-wise or gameplay-wise. Though with that said, this may not end up mattering at the end, as we know there is a swap coming next episode, so who knows what happens there. But really, I feel like this was such a bad look for Cedric that I had to have him at the very bottom, so he's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have the person who I had at the very bottom of last week's ranking, but we do have Star. And to me, this episode was more of the same for Star, where she once again doesn't get that much to do here, but despite that, is shown being on the bottom and not finding the Beware advantage. Now, there is a little bit of game talk where we do see her following up on targeting Eva and pulling the likes of Bianca and Thomas, and we do see them entertain this possibility of flipping the game against Eva, though that ends up being for naught. But really, I feel like Eva and Joe are clearly the rooting interest of the season, so that even if Star does try to take a shot against Eva later on, I feel like he'll probably just fail. So at the end of the day, I'm not feeling great about Star. I feel like this episode was just more the same for me, which is why she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have another person who I had towards the bottom, and here we have Chrissy. And again, this episode was more the same for her, where she was pretty under-edited, and she was actually the only person to not get a single confessional this episode, which this is the first episode to have someone getting no confessionals, that person being Chrissy. And again, I feel like she's not a priority in the story, probably not winning, not important to the actual story here, which is why she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who I've actually bumped down compared to last week, as I'm starting to become more and more out on this person. But number 12, we do have Bianca. And I know I got some comments last week talking about how I have Bianca too high. And again, I kind of get it, but I feel like based off the first two episodes, there was definitely some promise there. Though I think after this episode, I'm pretty much ready to drop her, as I feel like this episode really undermines the partnership that she had with Thomas, where we see in this episode that they don't seem to trust each other that much. We see Thomas even talking in this episode about how he doesn't really trust anyone, but Bianca's like the lesser evil. And then even beyond that, you have her losing her vote, and really a lot of her content in this episode is her going on the journey, which felt very circumstantial, very surface level there. You have her deciding to lie about the advantage to the rest of the tribe, but then telling the truth to Thomas, only for Thomas to later say that he is glad that Bianca told him about the advantage, but he's not going to tell her about his advantage. So at the end of the day, I'm not feeling great about this duo. I feel like this episode really did a lot to undermine them. And really with Bianca not getting that much screen time beyond that, not really getting much development beyond that, I'm starting to become out on Bianca, which is why I did drop her here to number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another person who I'm not feeling that great about at this point, and here we have Say. Now I will say that with this episode playing out the way that it did, and with us having this swap here, obviously Say is maybe going to be in a better spot at this point with her getting a fresh start on a new tribe, but really I feel like this episode did nothing to change my view of her. I feel like she's still like a pretty big character, someone who is definitely seen as a big player and someone who can be rootable because of that. But I think at this point we were starting to see this rivalry between Say and Mary, and with Mary being this underdog and Mary pulling off this somewhat impressive move by rolling the dice and hitting. I mean, I feel like it is setting up this foil with Mary and Say at this point. And I feel like this episode didn't really change my view of her. I feel like Say is still someone who's probably due for a fall at some point. So because of that, I'm not feeling the greatest about her to where she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have yet another person who I am not feeling that great about this point, though this was a better episode for them, I think. And here we have Kyle. And Kyle gets to talk more about his position on the tribe in this episode, where he talks about being in the middle and how he's glad to have all these options. Though I think a lot of that's undercut by the fact that Mitch and Charity were talking earlier in the episode about how they want Kyle and David around as he shields, and Kyle getting in that confessional right after Mitch is talking to Kyle about working with him makes me think that Kyle is just falling into Mitch and Charity's trap of wanting them to think they're running the game when in reality they're just these big threats to be taken out later. So I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for me when it comes to Kyle. Again, I feel like he is someone who's only being shown when absolutely necessary, and this is in a spot to where Mitch talked to him about game. And I feel like in that spot, we're supposed to be siding more with Mitch and Charity. We're supposed to be seeing them as more so driving the action here. And I feel like with Kyle not really getting great content beyond that, I feel like I can't really move him any higher than number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this person has gone up slightly compared to last week, as this was definitely a good episode for them, but certainly not enough to make them a contender. But number 9, we do have David. And this was a good episode for David. He definitely gets a lot of personal content here, talking about how he is poor and how he wants to start a family and how his girlfriend will leave him if he doesn't win, which is obviously pretty depressing there. So I feel like this was a good episode for David. Definitely makes him pretty sympathetic. Though I think mixing in how bad his first 2 episodes were with him coming off as a goober, I feel like while this is definitely an attempt to balance that and definitely makes him a more complex figure, I don't think it's enough to really elevate him into contention. And I feel like he's still definitely one of the bigger characters on the Siva tribe here. So while I feel like this was a good episode for him, and while he did move up a little bit, I'm probably a bit higher than other people at this point. I feel like those people have had more consistent edits at this point, which is why I do have David here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I'm probably a little bit higher on now, but I'm still questioning their true chances, and here we have Mitch. And I feel like Mitch is someone who definitely did go up a little bit as well after this episode, where this episode once again affirmed his relationship to Charity, and I feel like at this point it seems like Charity and Mitch are the important duo on the Siva tribe, even though they're about to swap, but whatever. But we do see them formulating this game plan this episode of talking to David and Kyle to pull them in order for them to be good meat shields. And I feel like that's all pretty good. I feel like Mitch and Charity are being set up to be this important duo, more so than what I thought before. Though with this said, I think I'm probably higher on Charity at this point, and I still have the same fundamental concerns about Mitch that I had before. I feel like even in this episode, I feel like Charity is probably the person who I came out at looking more highly compared to Mitch. And there's still this concern about Mitch being a target down the road, even though Mitch was technically the one to talk to Kyle about pulling him in. But I feel like this show doesn't highlight the fact that Mitch was the one to pull in Kyle. I feel like it's more so them working as a duo there. So at the end of the day, I feel like Mitch is someone who did go up a little bit after this episode, but not enough to make him a contender, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who I have gone down on over time. But number 7, we do have Thomas. And I think at this point, I'm out on Thomas. It's sort of funny how he was number 1 after the premiere, but I feel like with each passing episode, he just goes down and down. And this episode just kind of made him this villainous figure on this season. Mind you, we got pieces of that in episode 2, but I feel like this episode really cemented that, where we see him in this episode wanting to target Eva and Joe, in a spot to where Eva and Joe are meant to be these more heroic figures, especially Joe. So I feel like Thomas, getting to articulate that is not particularly great there. You also have him, talking in this episode about how he doesn't trust anyone, but Bianca's his number 1, I guess. And then him just saying that he's glad that Bianca told him about her situation while not telling her about his, which again just doesn't make him come off in that great of a light, makes him come off as a bit of a wheeler and dealer, someone who's a bit too of this villainous strategic figure here, so not someone we're going to be rooting for. In general, I feel like Thomas is someone who's probably set up for a fall at some point, with him eventually coming off as too big of a threat or someone who's a bit too schemy in the game. So I feel like this episode really lowered my view of Thomas. Definitely someone who is no longer in contention for me, which is why he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who did technically go down a spot compared to last week, but I feel like this episode wasn't the worst in the world for them. By number 6, we do have Camila. And this was just kind of a okay episode for Camila, if I'm being honest here, where she does talk about David being a Chad, only for David to then get his personal content showing his layers. So admittedly, that's not an ideal look there. But then beyond that, a lot of her content is pretty circumstantial, where she goes on the journey, gets an extra vote, and that's really the bulk of her content this episode, which is obviously not the greatest in the sense that her only content beyond that is basically undercutting David, which is probably not the greatest spot there. So really this episode didn't really move the needle for me when it came to Camila, but I feel like I'm more so a bit higher on other people, which is why she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person has gone up once again compared to last week, and I feel like now with where things stand in the game, I feel like I'm probably a bit more confident in this person to survive, and here we have Mary. And Mary is someone who has been on the upswing since episode 2, but I feel like this episode just further cemented her underdog status, where, yes, from a pure gameplay perspective, it is bad that she was essentially the consensus target here, and someone that had to play her shot in the dark in order to stay in the game, so obviously that's not ideal from a gameplay perspective, but from an edit perspective, I feel like Mary is clearly being set up as a strong underdog, and I feel like this episode further cemented the Mary and Say rivalry, where the fact that we get this whole scene of them running around the jungle trying to find the idol, only for them to talk about how they respect each other as players, just makes me think that this rivalry is going to be somewhat impactful in the season. And I feel like Mary is someone who I would expect to win this battle here at some point. And I think now that we're getting to a swap and Mary is someone who is no longer like automatically at the bottom, I think there's definitely a path for her to navigate through the game moving forward. And I feel like edit-wise, with her having this underdog arc, I feel like I'm probably more confident in Mary at this point than I have been all season. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens to her after the swap and how she handles her relationship with Say in that regard. So I have actually bumped up Mary here, even though she's someone who was a big target coming to Tribal. And I feel like with the way things are going right now, I did decide to elevate her here to number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I feel like a lot of these top contenders have remained the same compared to last week, though there is one new entry here. But number 4, I did decide to have Eva, and I am becoming a bit more skeptical about Eva here, where on one hand, I feel like this was not the greatest episode in the world for her, where she does decide to talk to his star about game and throwing Bianca and Thomas's name under the bus, which then gets us a setup to start going to Bianca and Thomas and want to target Eva. So obviously that's not particularly great. However, you could also argue that this is adversity that she is facing, where we have seen in the new era that plenty of winners have faced adversity in the pre-merge, or at least seemingly so. And I feel like if Eva were to go on to win, this could definitely be a case of Eva facing adversity in that regard, with her seeming like she could have been voted out had they gone the tribal here. But then beyond that, you have her relationship with Joe and getting to expand upon that, talking about how, like, back home they would make bonfires and that leads to her giving Joe a bracelet for his daughter and really getting to cement that relationship even more. And I think with Eva and Joe clearly meant to be the rooting interest in this battle between them and Bianca and Thomas, I feel like that definitely elevates Eva in that regard. Though at the same time, I feel like Joe is still like the main character in this duo, someone who is getting the bulk of the heroic content here. And I feel like with Eva having this tinge of negativity and someone who is not being shown playing the best in the world, I did decide to leave her behind here, even though I still think there's a shot that she could move up in the future. But for now, I do have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and as I alluded to a moment ago, this person is a new contender here. This person has really gone up compared to last week and even compared to week 1. But number 3, I do have Charity. And this seems like a bit of a stretch here. Charity is someone who I did not have the highest after the premiere, though I feel like since then, I feel like their edit has really picked up to where in this episode, we once again get this affirmation of her relationship with Mitch here. And I feel like they're meant to be seen as the strategic duo right in the middle here, where we see them like talking about pulling in like the likes of David and Kyle to build this new majority alliance. And it seems in a lot of ways that probably would have hold, but obviously a swap is coming, but whatever. But I still feel like Charity is someone who has been getting a pretty consistent presence, and outside the premiere where she got the negativity, I feel like I am probably higher on Charity at this point, where I feel like she is someone who is talking about how she is excited to start playing the game, how she really wants to work with Mitch, mixing in the fact that she at least got that confessional in the intro and the premiere, which I think is also really helping her here. And I feel like she's probably the person who inherently I would have more faith in to navigate to the end of the game compared to Mitch, who I think would probably be a big target down the road. So I actually feel like Charity is someone who I've been sliding up on over time. And it wouldn't shock me if over time Charity and Mitch do become like this major duo that's able to run a lot of the game. But I still feel like I'm more confident in the top 2 for the time being, which is why she is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I did debate whether this person was too high, and truth be told, I feel like I have some reservations with this person, but at number 2, I do have Shaheen. And Shaheen is someone who I still have plenty of concerns about, namely in the fact that he doesn't have a partnership, where even now in episode 3, he is talking about the tribe, talking about how he's part of the California Girls, but he himself does not have a partnership here, where from a pure gameplay perspective can be good in the sense that he is sort of in the middle of the tribe and has these connections to both pairs in the game. But at the same time, I feel like considering that partnerships are the theme of the season, I think that's a major hesitation there. But I think even beyond that, I feel like there has been some missed opportunities to give him personal content, where I still feel like I don't know that much about Shaheen. And I feel like through that, those are 2 pretty big issues with his edit up to this point. And it wouldn't shock me if, as other people start to get more well-rounded edits in the future, that Shaheen starts to move down. But at the same time, I feel like the people below him are people who admittedly are a bit more speculative picks, where the likes of Charity, for instance, still had that bad premiere, and through that, like, there's some question marks there. I feel like Eva is someone who, while there are definitely some potential upswings there, I think she's still someone who has gotten some negativity. And then Mary is someone who is definitely a speculative pick in that regard. I feel like Shaheen, for the time being, is still a relatively safe pick here, even though there are still some reservations, as I feel like he is still someone who I expect to be a major character on the season. But admittedly, I feel like this is more so a placeholder for him until later on the season, but for now I do have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 48 at this current point is still Joe. And I think sort of similar to Shaheen, this is debatably a placeholder spot for Joe, where I feel like Joe is someone who definitely comes off as a bit too obvious of a winner. I think he's still someone who is getting such an over-the-top positive edit that makes me wonder if he is truly going to be the winner of the season by the end of it. Where in this episode, he gets this massive segment about how he wants to build a bonfire and how he wants to be a good dad and how he wants his kids to see him as a good man. So obviously, those things are all pretty good. I think he's clearly the rooting interest of the season. And obviously, this was, again, another episode where he gets pretty strong content, more of the same there. And I thought this episode didn't really do much to lower my opinion of him outside of the notion of him being too obvious. Now, again, there's still this possibility of these more speculative picks moving up in the future, but I feel like based on the evidence we currently have, Joe's probably the person who I have the most confidence in actually pulling out the win, probably the person that I would expect the show to want us to root for the most, and I feel like until I'm proven otherwise, until I'm given a clear alternative, I am going to have to leave Joe this high. So while I'm still a bit uneasy about it, I do have Joe here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it'll help with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Australian Survivor along with The Amazing Race, so if you want videos on those, be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.